Imagine a war-torn Italian village at the very end of World War II. The air is thick with smoke, the ruins of burned homes casting long shadows across a battered town square. In the center, a scene unfolds that almost no one in America has ever heard about. A moment so intense, so morally charged, that it would challenge everything you think you know about the chaos of war. It's April 29, 1945. The world is on the edge of victory, but in the small town of Fornovo di Terro, a new battle is about to erupt, not between armies but between justice and revenge. At the heart of the square stands a German general, his uniform still crisp, his face drained of color. He's just surrendered his pistol to a Brazilian colonel, officially ending his fight. But the real danger is only beginning. Surrounding the general, a group of Brazilian soldiers, men from a country most Americans barely associate with World War II, form a tight human shield. Their rifles are raised, not at the enemy but at a furious crowd of Italian partisans and civilians. These are people who have lost everything to the Nazi occupation: their homes, their families, their sense of safety. Now, with the war almost over, they want one thing: revenge. They don't care about military protocol or international law. They want blood, and they want it now. But the Brazilians refuse to step aside. 8 soldiers, outnumbered and exhausted, stand between the mob and the man they once called their enemy. Their orders are clear: protect the prisoners, no matter the cost. The tension is electric. One wrong move, one spark, and the square could explode into violence that would stain the final days of the war with even more tragedy. Why would these soldiers risk their lives to defend a defeated enemy? What code of honor could possibly be strong enough to make men stand against a tidal wave of rage, especially when the world would look the other way? This isn't just a story about the end of World War II. It's a story about the power of principle, the meaning of justice, and the kind of courage that rarely makes it into American history books. If you think you know everything about the heroes of World War II, think again. The actions of these Brazilian soldiers, practically unknown in the U.S., would shock even the most seasoned historians. Their decision in that Italian square would echo across decades, changing the way the world saw not just Brazil, but the very idea of what it means to win a war without losing your soul. And what happened next would test the limits of human decency, forcing everyone, soldiers, civilians, and even the enemy, to confront the true cost of vengeance and the rare, unbreakable strength of mercy. Stay with us, because the story you're about to hear is one the world tried to forget, but America needs to remember. The story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in World War II is almost invisible in American classrooms. But what happened on April 29, 1945, in northern Italy was nothing short of historic. While most Americans picture the final days of the war as a series of Allied victories led by U.S. and British forces, a completely unexpected chapter was being written by soldiers from South America, soldiers who would change the rules of surrender forever. On that fateful afternoon, the dusty roads outside Fornovo di Terro were lined with the defeated. Over 14,000 German troops, entire regiments, officers, medics, and even armored units, marched out of the hills and laid down their weapons in neat, silent rows. Machine guns, mortars, and battered vehicles formed a grim parade of surrender. This wasn't just a handful of stragglers. It was the entire 148th German Infantry Division, one of the last intact Nazi units in Italy. And they weren't surrendering to the Americans or the British. They were surrendering to the Brazilians. For the first and only time in the Italian campaign, a full German division gave up before the final armistice. It was a moment that stunned even the Allied command. Reports from the front lines described the scene as unprecedented, a word rarely used in the chaos of World War II. The Brazilian colonel in charge, Nelson de Melo, walked among the surrendered troops, clipboard in hand, recording every detail. His men followed strict orders: treat every prisoner according to the Geneva Convention, no matter what horrors had happened in the mountains and villages just days before. This was more than just military discipline. It was a statement to the world. The Brazilian soldiers, many of them young, poor, and far from home, were determined to show that even in the ashes of war there was room for dignity. No one shouted insults. No one lashed out in anger. The prisoners were separated into groups, officers from enlisted men, wounded from the healthy, and each was given food, water, and medical attention. Even as the smell of burning homes drifted through the air, the Brazilians held the line, not just against the enemy, but against the urge for revenge. For the German general, the surrender was a moment of crushing humiliation. His hands shook as he handed over his personal sidearm, not out of fear, but from the weight of defeat. He had commanded men in battle, issued orders that changed lives and destroyed towns, and now he was at the mercy of soldiers he'd been taught to underestimate. The propaganda he'd heard in Berlin about the supposed inferiority of the Allies from the Americas crumbled in the face of the discipline and humanity shown by the Brazilians. But the surrender was only the beginning. As the Brazilian soldiers processed the endless lines of prisoners, a new threat began to gather at the edges of the road. Italian civilians, men, women, and children who had survived years of Nazi occupation, started to appear, their faces hard with grief and anger. They watched in silence at first, but soon their pain boiled over. Stones were thrown, curses shouted, and the fragile peace of the surrender teetered on the edge of collapse. The Americans and British had seen their share of chaos in the final days of the war, but what was happening in Fornovo was different. The Brazilians were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting to uphold a code of honor in the face of overwhelming pressure. Their actions would soon be tested in ways no one could have predicted, and the world would be forced to ask, what does it really mean to win a war? The answer, as you'll see, would not be found on the battlefield, but in the choices made after the shooting stopped. And for the Brazilian soldiers, the hardest battle was still to come. As the sun dipped lower over the battered streets of Fornovo di Terro, the atmosphere shifted from tense to explosive. The surrender of thousands of German soldiers to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was supposed to mark the end of violence in this corner of Italy. But for the local civilians, Italians who had survived years of Nazi brutality, the war was far from over. For them, justice wasn't a matter of paperwork or international law. It was personal, raw, and burning with the pain of loss. Word spread quickly through the village. The men who had torched homes, executed neighbors, and shattered families were now sitting quietly under Brazilian guard. At first, it was just a few curious children peering from behind broken walls. Then came the mothers, their faces lined with grief, clutching photographs of sons and husbands who would never return. Soon the crowd swelled with men, some old, some barely more than boys, armed with whatever they could find, pitchforks, kitchen knives, even rusty hunting rifles. These weren't soldiers. They were survivors, and their anger was volcanic. The Americans who fought in Europe knew the rage that could boil up in liberated towns. But what happened next in Fornovo was something different, something that would test the very soul of the Brazilian soldiers. The crowd began to shout, their voices echoing off the ruined buildings. "Assassins!" they screamed in Italian. "Murderers! You killed our children!" The pain in their words was unmistakable, and it cut through the air like a knife. Suddenly, a stone flew from the crowd, striking a German prisoner in the forehead. Blood trickled down his face, but he didn't move. He knew that any reaction could mean instant death. The mob surged forward, their grief and fury threatening to overwhelm the thin line of Brazilian guards. The situation was seconds away from spiraling into a massacre. At that moment, a young Brazilian lieutenant stepped forward. He didn't speak fluent Italian, but his message was clear. With his hand raised, he pleaded for calm, not with threats, but with a simple, powerful statement. "They are our prisoners now." The words, translated by an interpreter, hung in the air. For a split second, the crowd hesitated, but the thirst for vengeance was too strong. One of the partisans, a man with a scar across his cheek, pointed at the German general and shouted, "That one ordered the burning of Moncio. 13 children died. You're going to protect him." The Brazilians' answer was quiet but unyielding. "We will, because we are not like them." The crowd recoiled as if struck. For a moment, the line between justice and revenge became painfully clear. Some in the mob spat on the ground and turned away, but others pressed closer, their eyes wild with grief. The Brazilian soldiers tightened their formation, becoming a living barrier between the prisoners and the mob. Their rifles weren't aimed at the Germans. They were pointed at the very people they had come to liberate. This was a moment that would have tested any American unit, a moment where the easy path would have been to step aside and let the mob have its way. But the Brazilians stood firm, risking their own lives to uphold a principle that went beyond orders or alliances. They understood that if they allowed vengeance to rule, the difference between liberator and oppressor would vanish in an instant. The tension was suffocating. More civilians arrived, some carrying ropes, others brandishing knives. An elderly woman tried to claw at a German officer, screaming about her murdered grandson. Brazilian soldiers gently but firmly held her back, their faces etched with empathy and exhaustion. They knew her pain, but they also knew that justice could not be built on another act of violence. As the standoff dragged on, the Brazilian commander climbed onto a jeep and addressed the crowd. His words, translated into Italian, rang out over the square. "We came here to restore the law, not to take revenge. These men will answer for their crimes in a court, not in the street. If you want true justice, let us do our duty." The crowd murmured, torn between rage and respect. Some shouted that no court could bring back the dead. Others warned that the Allies would let the Germans go free. But the Brazilians' answer was unwavering. "If we let vengeance replace justice, we become what we fought against." For nearly an hour, the fate of the prisoners and the honor of the Brazilian force hung in the balance. The world outside would never know how close Fornovo came to becoming another tragedy. But in that moment, the Brazilian soldiers made a choice that would echo far beyond the war. They chose principle over passion, law over chaos, and humanity over hate. And as night fell, the world would see just how far these men were willing to go to defend not just their prisoners, but the very idea of justice itself. As darkness crept over the shattered rooftops of Fornovo di Terro, the world seemed to hold its breath. The Brazilian soldiers, outnumbered and exhausted, stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a living wall between the furious Italian mob and the defeated German prisoners. In that tense Italian square, the line between order and chaos was drawn not by barbed wire or barricades, but by the courage of a handful of men who refused to let vengeance win. For American viewers, it's hard to imagine the pressure these soldiers faced. The U.S. military has its own stories of holding the line under fire, but this was different. The threat wasn't coming from enemy troops. It was coming from the very people the Brazilians had come to liberate. Every second, the risk of violence grew. The mob's anger was a living thing, fueled by years of Nazi occupation, by memories of loved ones lost, by the ruins of homes and churches still smoldering in the night. The Brazilian sergeant at the front of the line, a man from the rural heartland, locked eyes with an Italian partisan just feet away. The partisan's hands shook with rage, his face streaked with tears. He could have been any American's neighbor, any father or brother pushed to the edge by war. The sergeant didn't flinch. He held his rifle horizontally, not as a threat, but as a barrier, a silent promise that no more blood would be spilled tonight. All around them, the tension was electric. The Brazilian soldiers whispered to each other in Portuguese, their voices steady but strained. They knew that one wrong move could trigger a massacre. Yet they held their ground, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed that justice had to mean more than revenge, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. The mob pressed closer. Some carried ropes, others brandished knives or makeshift clubs. A few tried to break through the line only to be gently but firmly pushed back. The Brazilian soldiers didn't shout or threaten. They simply stood unyielding, their faces set with determination. For the German prisoners, it was a moment of surreal disbelief. They had expected brutality, maybe even death. Instead, they found themselves shielded by men who, just days before, had been their enemies. Inside the ring of soldiers, the German general sat on the ground, his head bowed. He listened to the shouts and curses, the cries for vengeance, and realized that his fate rested in the hands of men he had been taught to despise. The propaganda he'd heard in Berlin about the supposed savagery of Allied troops from the Americas was being shattered in real time. The Brazilians were risking their own lives to protect him, not because they had to, but because they chose to. As the standoff dragged on, the Brazilian commander made a bold move. He climbed onto the hood of a battered jeep and addressed the crowd, his words translated into Italian by a local interpreter. "We understand your pain," he said. "We came here to free you, not to become executioners. If you want justice, let us do our duty. If you want vengeance, you will have to go through us." The message was clear. The line would not be crossed. For nearly an hour, the two sides faced off in the fading light. The mob's fury ebbed and flowed, but the Brazilians never wavered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the energy in the square began to shift. Some Italians, exhausted by grief, turned away. Others, still burning with anger, spat on the ground and cursed the soldiers. But the line held. The Brazilian human shield had done the impossible. It had stopped the cycle of violence, at least for one night. For American viewers, this moment is a powerful reminder of what it means to stand for principle under unimaginable pressure. The Brazilian soldiers could have stepped aside. No one would have blamed them. But they chose the harder path, the path of restraint and honor. In doing so, they not only saved lives, they set an example that would echo far beyond the war. As the night deepened and the crowd finally began to disperse, the Brazilian soldiers remained at their posts, watching over their prisoners and their would-be attackers alike. They knew the danger wasn't over. But for that one night, in a forgotten corner of Italy, they had proven that true strength isn't measured by firepower or numbers, but by the courage to do what's right when it matters most. And as dawn approached, the world would soon see just how far these men were willing to go to defend not just their orders, but the very idea of justice itself. As the first light of dawn crept over the Italian countryside, the Brazilian soldiers prepared for a journey that would test their resolve like never before. The surrender at Fornovo di Terro was just the beginning. Now, the real challenge was about to unfold, a dangerous march through villages scarred by war, with hundreds of German prisoners in tow and the ever-present threat of civilian vengeance lurking at every turn. For American audiences, the image of Allied troops escorting prisoners of war might conjure up scenes of order and discipline. But in Italy in the spring of 1945, nothing was certain. The roads were lined with ruins, the air heavy with the memory of atrocities committed by the retreating Nazis. Every village the column passed through had its own story of loss, names of the dead carved into stone, bullet holes marking the walls of churches, and families still mourning loved ones taken by violence. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, tasked with transferring the German prisoners to Allied custody, faced a gauntlet of pain and anger. The route would take them through three devastated towns, San Secondo, Fontevivo, and Fidenza. Each step forward was a step deeper into a landscape haunted by grief. The soldiers knew that the greatest danger wasn't from the prisoners themselves, but from the people they had come to liberate. As the column moved out, the Brazilian commander made a bold decision. Instead of sneaking the prisoners through under cover of darkness, he ordered the march to take place in broad daylight. The message was clear. Brazil had nothing to hide. The world would see that these men, even as victors, would not stoop to the level of their enemies. The rifles of the Brazilian guards were pointed outward, not at the Germans, but at the crowds gathering along the route, crowds that could turn violent at any moment. The first confrontation came at a narrow bridge in San Secondo. A group of Italian partisans, armed with makeshift weapons and burning with rage, blocked the way. Their leader, a young man with a scar on his face, shouted accusations at the Brazilian major at the head of the column. "You protect murderers. You are no better than them." The major's response was calm but firm. We are protecting prisoners, not murderers. If you can't see the difference, then the war has already won. The standoff was tense, the air thick with the possibility of violence, but the Brazilians didn't flinch. They began to clear the barricade plank by plank under the watchful eyes of the partisans. No shots were fired. No blows were exchanged. The message was unmistakable. Justice would not be delivered by mob rule. But the danger was far from over. In Fontevivo, the column entered a town square still draped with the ropes used to hang civilians just months before. The crowd here was larger, angrier, and more desperate. An elderly woman, dressed in black, broke through the line and spat in the face of the German general. Her grief was overwhelming. Her husband and sons had been killed, her home destroyed. She screamed for vengeance, brandishing a kitchen knife. Brazilian soldiers intervened, not with force but with compassion. One young soldier, barely older than a teenager, gently held her hands and spoke softly. "If we let this become a massacre, we dishonor your dead. Justice, not revenge, is what they deserve." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the crowd hesitated. Some wept openly, others cursed the soldiers, but the line held. The march continued. By the time the column reached Fidenza, the tension was almost unbearable. The German prisoners, heads bowed, marched in silence, fully aware that their lives depended on the discipline of their captors. The Brazilian soldiers, sweating under their helmets, never let their guard down. They knew that one act of violence could ignite a bloodbath. For American viewers, this march is a powerful reminder of the thin line between order and chaos in wartime. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, far from home and fighting in a foreign land, chose to uphold the highest ideals of the Allied cause. They became a human shield, not just for their prisoners, but for the very idea of justice itself. As the sun set on that long, harrowing day, the column finally reached its destination. The prisoners were handed over to Allied authorities, unharmed. The Brazilian soldiers had done the impossible. They had protected their enemies, honored their allies, and proven that even in the darkest moments, principle could triumph over passion. But the story doesn't end there. What happened next would leave a mark not just on the men who marched that day, but on the very legacy of World War II itself. For the German prisoners, the days following their surrender were a journey into the unknown. Many had braced themselves for the worst, expecting beatings, humiliation, or even summary execution at the hands of their captors. After years of Nazi propaganda, they believed that Allied soldiers, especially those from distant countries like Brazil, would show no mercy. But what unfolded in the makeshift prison camps of northern Italy would shatter every expectation and leave a mark that would last a lifetime. As the Brazilian Expeditionary Force processed the thousands of German prisoners, a quiet sense of disbelief spread among the captives. Instead of cruelty, they encountered discipline. Instead of vengeance, they found order. The Brazilian guards, many of whom had never set foot outside their own country before the war, treated the prisoners with a level of humanity that was almost unimaginable in the context of 1945. Food was shared, medical care was provided, and even the most basic needs, blankets, water, a kind word, were not denied. For American viewers, it's important to understand just how rare this was in the final days of World War II. Across Europe, stories of retribution and violence against German prisoners were common. In some sectors, summary executions and brutal interrogations were the norm. But in the Brazilian camps, the rules were different. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a code to be lived by, even when no one was watching. One story stands out: a young German soldier, barely 19, who had been wounded during the retreat. He was terrified, convinced that his injury would be a death sentence. Instead, he was rushed to a Brazilian field hospital, where doctors worked for hours to save his life. The same morphine and bandages used for Brazilian soldiers were used for him. When he awoke after surgery, he found a Brazilian guard sitting by his side, making sure he survived the night. The young German broke down in tears, not from pain, but from the shock of being treated as a human being by those he had been taught to hate. The impact of this treatment rippled through the German ranks. Rumors spread quickly. The Brazilians were different. They didn't beat prisoners. They didn't hand them over to vengeful partisans. They didn't even insult them. For many German soldiers, this was the first time they had experienced compassion from an enemy. It was a revelation that shook the very foundations of what they had been told about the world. Even the German general, a man who had spent his entire career steeped in the rigid hierarchy and racial ideology of the Nazi regime, was forced to confront a new reality. Sitting in his tent under Brazilian guard, he reflected on the lectures he had attended in Berlin, lectures that painted the Allies, especially those from inferior nations, as barbarians. Now, he was being protected by men who risked their own lives to shield him from lynching. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The general later admitted in a rare interview that the experience shattered his faith in everything he had been taught about race, civilization, and the nature of war. For the Brazilian soldiers, this was not just a matter of following orders. It was a conscious choice to uphold a higher standard, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. Their actions sent a message, not just to the Germans, but to the world. In a time when brutality was the norm, they proved that mercy was possible. In a war defined by dehumanization, they chose to see the enemy as human. For American viewers, this story is a powerful reminder of the values that the Allies claimed to fight for, values that were sometimes forgotten in the heat of battle, but never abandoned by those who understood their true meaning. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, far from home and fighting in a foreign land, became a living example of what it means to win not just with weapons, but with principles. The legacy of their actions would echo far beyond the war. German prisoners who survived the camps carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Some wrote letters of thanks. Others told their families about the unexpected kindness they received from men they had once called enemies. And for the Brazilian soldiers, the experience became a point of pride, a story passed down through generations, a testament to the power of humanity in the darkest of times. But the world was watching, too. What happened in those camps would soon draw the attention of international observers, setting the stage for a new chapter in the story, one where the actions of a few would change the way the world thought about justice, honor, and the true meaning of victory. As the dust settled over the Italian countryside, the world began to take notice of what had happened in those makeshift prison camps guarded by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. For many Americans, the story of World War II is filled with iconic moments: D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. But few know about the quiet revolution in military ethics that unfolded in the shadow of the Apennines, where a group of soldiers from South America set a new standard for the treatment of prisoners of war. The first to recognize the extraordinary conduct of the Brazilians were the international observers. Representatives from the International Red Cross, known for their strict neutrality and rigorous inspections, arrived at the camps expecting to find the usual signs of war's aftermath: bruised faces, broken spirits, and stories of abuse. Instead, they found order, discipline, and a level of care that was almost unheard of in the chaos of 1945. The Red Cross inspectors interviewed German prisoners at random, asking about food, medical care, and the behavior of the guards. The answers were unanimous. The Brazilians had treated them with respect, provided medical attention, and ensured their safety, even when it meant standing up to angry mobs or risking their own lives. The Red Cross reports, filed in Geneva and circulated among Allied command, were glowing. They singled out the Brazilian Expeditionary Force as a model of compliance with the Geneva Convention. In a world where news of atrocities and revenge killings was all too common, the Brazilians stood out as a beacon of humanity. Their actions were contrasted sharply with reports from other sectors, where German prisoners faced summary executions or were handed over to partisans for retribution. The difference was not just a matter of policy, it was a matter of principle. American officers stationed in Italy took note. Some visited the Brazilian camps themselves, curious about the stories they had heard. What they saw left a lasting impression. The camps were orderly, the prisoners well-fed, and the guards professional. One U.S. major, after touring the facilities, remarked that the Brazilians had set a standard that all Allied forces should aspire to. His report was forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching the desks of generals and policymakers in Washington, D.C. The impact of the Brazilians' conduct rippled outward. British officers, too, were struck by the condition of the prisoners when they were officially transferred to Allied custody. There were no signs of abuse, no broken bones, no black eyes, no evidence of torture. When asked about their interrogation methods, the Brazilian officers replied simply, "Interrogation does not require brutality." This statement, recorded in official Allied reports, would later be cited in debates about the ethics of prisoner treatment, not just in World War II, but in conflicts for decades to come. But perhaps the most powerful recognition came not from officials or inspectors, but from the families of the German prisoners themselves. In the months after the war, letters began to arrive at Brazilian military headquarters, letters written in halting Portuguese, translated by Red Cross volunteers. Mothers thanked the Brazilians for saving their sons' lives. Wives expressed gratitude for the food and medical care their husbands had received. These letters did not excuse the crimes of the Nazi regime, nor did they ask for forgiveness. They simply acknowledged a basic truth. In a world gone mad, the Brazilians had chosen to act with decency. For American viewers, this chapter of the war is a reminder that the true measure of victory is not just in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the standards we set for ourselves. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, fighting far from home and often overlooked in the grand narrative of World War II, became a symbol of what the Allied cause was supposed to represent: justice, honor, and the refusal to become what we were fighting against. The legacy of their actions would echo in military academies, diplomatic circles, and human rights organizations for years to come. The Red Cross reports became case studies in international law classes. The stories of the Brazilian guards were retold in lectures on military ethics. And in the quiet moments after the war, when the world tried to make sense of the horrors it had witnessed, the example set by these soldiers offered a glimmer of hope, a proof that even in the darkest times, it is possible to hold on to our humanity. But the story doesn't end with recognition. The choices made by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force would shape the way future generations understood the meaning of justice, the power of restraint, and the enduring value of principle in a world too often tempted by revenge. Long after the guns fell silent in Europe, the story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Forces stand in Italy continued to ripple across continents and generations. For most Americans, the legacy of World War II is measured in iconic images: soldiers storming Normandy, the flag rising over Iwo Jima, the liberation of Paris. But hidden in the shadows of these famous moments is a lesson that resonates just as powerfully today: the quiet heroism of ordinary men who chose principle over passion and humanity over hate. In Italy, the memory of those days in 1945 never faded. Towns like Fornovo di Terro, Montes, and Pistia built monuments and museums to honor the Prasinhas, the Brazilian soldiers who had come from a distant land to fight for freedom. Schoolchildren learned not just about the battles, but about the choices made after the fighting stopped. They heard stories of Brazilian soldiers sharing food with hungry civilians, protecting surrendered enemies from lynching, and treating the wounded, friend or foe, with the same care. For many Italians, the Prasinhas became symbols of a different kind of victory, one that went beyond military conquest to touch the very soul of a nation. But the impact didn't stop at the Italian border. In Brazil, the veterans of the Expeditionary Force returned home to a country that often struggled to recognize their sacrifice. Many faced years of neglect, inadequate pensions, and little official acknowledgement. Yet, among their families and communities, their stories lived on. Grandchildren grew up hearing about the day their grandfather stood between a mob and a helpless prisoner, or the night he shared his last ration with a starving enemy. These stories became part of the fabric of Brazilian identity, a reminder that true courage is not just about facing the enemy, but about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. For American viewers, the lessons of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force offer a fresh perspective on what it means to be a hero. In a world where the lines between good and evil are often blurred by the fog of war, the Prasen has showed that it's possible to fight with honor, to win without losing your soul. Their actions in Italy proved three powerful truths, truths that still matter in every conflict, every courtroom, and every community across the United States. First, real discipline isn't just about following orders in battle. It's about holding onto your principles when the world is falling apart around you. The Brazilian soldiers could have looked the other way, could have let vengeance take its course. No one would have blamed them, but they chose the harder path because they understood that a code of honor only means something when it costs you. Second, humanity is not a weakness. It's a strategic strength. The way the Brazilians treated their prisoners didn't just win them praise from the Red Cross or Allied commanders. It broke the will of the enemy. German soldiers began to surrender specifically to the Brazilians, knowing they would be treated with dignity. This saved lives on both sides and proved that compassion can be a weapon more powerful than any rifle. And third, perhaps most important of all, you can fight evil without becoming evil. The Prasen has showed that you don't have to abandon your conscience to win a war. You can be relentless in battle and merciful in victory. You can destroy an enemy's ability to fight without destroying your own humanity. In a time when atrocities were common, even among the so-called good guys, the Brazilians stood out as proof that another way was possible. Today, the legacy of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force is preserved not just in stone monuments or dusty archives, but in the living memory of those who study the Second World War. In Italy, schoolchildren still visit the cemeteries and museums dedicated to the Prasenhas. In Brazil, families still tell the stories of courage and compassion that defined a generation. And for Americans, these stories offer a powerful reminder that the values we cherish, justice, honor, and respect for human life, are not just words in a history book. They are choices, made one moment at a time by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. As the world faces new challenges and new conflicts, the example set by the Brazilian soldiers in Italy remains as relevant as ever. Their story is a call to remember that the true test of character comes not when victory is easy, but when the right thing to do is also the hardest. And in that test, the Prasen has passed with a courage that deserves to be remembered, not just in Brazil or Italy, but in every corner of the world where people still believe in the power of principle. As we close the chapter on this remarkable story, it's impossible not to reflect on the deeper meaning behind the actions of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in Italy. For most Americans, World War II is a tapestry of heroism, sacrifice, and unforgettable moments. But the story of the Prasenhas, the Brazilian soldiers who risked everything to protect their enemies from vengeance, offers a lesson that goes far beyond the battlefield. It's a lesson about the power of principle, the strength of restraint, and the enduring value of humanity, even in the darkest of times. Think about what these men faced. Far from home, surrounded by devastation, they stood between a furious mob and the very soldiers who had once been their mortal enemies. They could have chosen the easy path, letting anger and grief dictate their actions. Instead, they chose the harder road, one paved with discipline, compassion, and an unbreakable code of honor. In doing so, they didn't just save lives, they preserved the very ideals that the Allies claimed to fight for. For American viewers, this story is a powerful reminder that the true legacy of World War II isn't just found in the victories won or the enemies defeated. It's found in the moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices, when they refused to let hatred define them, when they protected the vulnerable, and when they showed the world that justice and mercy can walk hand in hand. The actions of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force echo the best traditions of the American spirit, standing up for what's right, even when it's unpopular or dangerous. The impact of their choices didn't end with the war. Their example shaped international law, inspired future generations of soldiers, and built bridges of respect between nations. In Italy, their memory is kept alive in monuments and museums. In Brazil, their stories are passed down through families. And for those who study history in the United States, their legacy is a challenge, a call to remember that the real test of character comes not in moments of triumph, but in moments of moral crisis. As we look at the world today, with its new conflicts and old divisions, the story of the Prasinhas is more relevant than ever. It asks us to consider, what kind of victory do we want to achieve? Is it enough to defeat an enemy, or must we also defend the values that make us who we are? The Brazilian soldiers in Italy answered that question with their actions, showing that true strength lies not in domination, but in dignity. So if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what it means to be a hero, let your voice be heard. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from in the United States. Share this video with friends and family who care about history, justice, and the power of doing what's right. And if you want to dive even deeper into untold stories of World War II, check out the exclusive content linked in the comments. Because the memory of these men, and the lessons they left behind, deserve to be preserved and shared. In a world that too often forgets the cost of war and the value of mercy, let's keep the legacy of the Prasinhas alive. Let's remember that the greatest victories are not just those won on the battlefield, but those won in the hearts and minds of people who choose humanity over hate. That's a story worth telling, not just in Brazil or Italy, but right here in America, for generations to come.